There is a lot of doom porn out there. A load of people saying that house prices are going to crash like a meteor to earth, all that sort of thing, and pretty soon you'll be able to buy a house with your club card points or down the middle aisle of an Aldi or something like that. So in this video we're going to be looking at the predictions for house prices for the next couple of years. Do we think house prices are going to fall, and by how much? We're going to be looking at what the data says, what the experts say, and what the analysis says. So we're going to be looking at the data and weighing it up with poker chips. But before we get into this, there is just one thing I want to point out. The housing market is part of the economy, an incredibly complex network and web of interconnected variables that are all reliant on one another. We're not necessarily going to be making a value judgment on whether prices should fall or should rise. Now, for these purposes, red poker chips will be house decline, green poker chips will be house price increases. So just a 30-second snapshot of the state of the housing market. There has been a decline in house prices between 3 and 5%, depending on if you go from the data from Halifax or Nationwide. And last month they did actually rise slightly. This means that the average cost of a home is now around £259,000, down from about £268 last year. But house prices are still well above where they were before COVID. Now, the first thing we're going to look at is inflation. Now, the Bank of England expects inflation to come down through to 2024, but they don't expect to hit their target until about 2025. So this, decline, for two reasons. First is that as inflation increases, less of people's disposable income can go towards making their mortgage repayments, so that's puts downward pressure on house prices. The second is interest rates. Given that inflation is likely to be consistent for the next couple of years, that means that the interest rates that the Bank of England set are unlikely to come down for the next couple of years. So higher interest rates are going to put, again, downward pressure on prices. And the UK inflation rate has been and remains stubbornly higher when compared to other G7 or Eurozone economies. The third thing is the cost of living crisis. The red one, not looking good already. So the cost of living crisis has been sparked by a whole host of geopolitical events, which we won't go into, but ultimately it's meant that lots of things are now more expensive than they otherwise were. This just means that people have less money at the end of every month. House building targets. Now, Labour looks set to win the next general election. Obviously, lots of other things can happen, blah, blah, blah. This is not a party political point. But they have said that they are going to build 1.5 million homes over 3 years. Now, that sounds pretty impressive until you look at a diagram like this, which shows that 300,000 homes is where we should have been, a target that we haven't hit since about 1978. So ultimately, if house building remains low, house prices are likely to increase. And this is driven by the fact that so few houses are built here in the UK that we have a constantly restricted supply, which pushes prices up. The next is foreign investment, another green one. Now, the UK, in particular central London, has been a hotspot for property investment for the last 20 years because of rising prices. Now, as prices start to decrease, I think it's fair to say that there will be plenty of foreign investors who will look to swoop in on some bargains in the hope that the house prices will recover and they'll be in it for the longer game. The next is planning changes. Now, again, this is not a party political point, but Labour have said that if they get into power, one of the first things they're going to look at is going to be resolving what they call the archaic planning system. At the moment, the way the planning system works is that there are so many criteria that have to be met that getting new houses built can be incredibly difficult and hard to do. So they've introduced what will be sort of effectively the presumption of passing, that if a house meets certain criteria around energy efficiency and affordability, then the application will by default pass. So this will lead to more houses available because house building will become easier. House prices are more likely to fall. The next is house builders' profits. Now, the UK is dominated by about a dozen or so extremely large house builders. To give you an idea, the top 5 house builders in the UK make up about 50% of all new homes built in the UK. They're an extremely influential lobby group, and so you can bet your bottom dollar that if they're planning to build millions of homes over the next decade, they want to get the most money they can for each home. So they will invariably, I suspect, lobby government to change the rules to try and bolster house prices. A green one. Mortgages. Now, around 100,000 people a month are coming off their fixed rate mortgages, and one of the things that we've seen really fall is that net mortgage approvals have started to decrease. And because cash buyers represent about a third of overall transactions, this is potentially another big problem as more and more people fail the affordability checks. Institutional investors. We've seen this predominantly in the States, but not exclusively, where big gargantuan companies are buying up swathes of property all over the place. Now, this adds more buyers into the market who have the deepest pockets in the world, conceivably, and they can move very quickly and buy lots of houses all at once. So this is going to bolster prices. Government support for the housing market. Housing policy for the last 10-20 years or so has focused around demand rather than supply. The Help to Buy scheme jumped up prices. Introducing another scheme like that will help to bolster prices. Regional variances. The UK housing is not some like monolith where one rule applies to all or anything crazy like that. One of the things which this helpful diagram from Savills show is that there's actually quite a lot of regional difference in overall house prices. So it may well be that because of the value of London properties, that skews the overall market, so maybe it's not so bad. Next is mortgage arrears. Numbers came out recently that showed mortgage arrears have jumped about 18%. Bad news. Buy-to-let landlords. The majority of these mortgage arrears have actually come from buy-to-let landlords, so they are fleeing the marketplace, increasing the supply of homes on the market. Wage growth has remained reasonably strong. It's still not necessarily caught all the way up to inflation, but it's on the way up. And unemployment remains low. An ageing economy. The UK has an ageing population, so we're finding that actually the amount of houses available that have single occupancies in are on the rise. And the last point is climate change. Rising sea levels and increased floodplains means that as an island there's only a set amount of land that we can build on, and that is potentially going to get smaller. So when we stack these two together, we find that the reds just about outweigh the greens. So let's go into it a bit more. I think the first thing to mention is that this is not the same as the 2008 financial crisis, a financial crisis that was precipitated by subprime mortgage loans being lent out to anyone with a pulse. What we're seeing here in these chips is a combination of a whole myriad of factors that are all working together, some to pull prices up, some to push prices down. So Halifax said that house prices are likely to fall 4.7% this year and 2.4% in 2024. Rightmove have forecasted that house prices will fall a little more than 5% in 2024, and the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, has said that there will be a peak-to-peak fall of around 10%. This would take us back to prices around autumn 2021, which is still well above pre-COVID house price levels. Capital Economics forecasts that house prices will fall between 5 and 6% in 2023 and 2 to 3% in 2025. So what does all this tell us? The consensus seems to be that house prices will gradually decline into 2023 and well into 2024, with some moderate growth, we'll call it, into 2025. So when we look at all this information, I think you arrive at a couple of conclusions. The first is that one thing that's always worth keeping in mind is when you buy a house, you're buying it for 5 or 10 years. Now, that's partly because of the effect of stamp duty. Stamp duty makes the housing market really lumpy, and so if you're not staying in a house for 5 to 10 years, then you're not really offsetting that cost anyway. Where will house prices be in 10 or 20 years? I think it's safe to say above where they are now. You also run the risk of trying to time the market, and you can win some, but you also can lose some. And so now you're armed with this information, the next obvious question is, what should you do? Should you buy now, or should you wait until 2024 or 2025 to buy a house? That's our next video. Click just here to go straight to it, and thanks very much for watching. Thanks very much for watching. This has been another episode of Modern Money Talk, where we talk all things personal finance, personal development related. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and comment below what are your expectations for the housing market for the next few years, and what do you think is going to happen. Peace.